There exists a story absent from the official cavalry ledgers. You can pore over every dispatch General Crook sent from the Sierra Madre in 1886, scrutinize every after-action report, and read every personal letter, but you'll find not a single mention of what I'm about to share. The Army had it excised from the file before the ink had even dried. This was precisely the sort of thing the Army excelled at removing. Only a single person ever committed it to paper, and he was no soldier. He was a Catholic priest in Bavispe, a mining town down in Sonora. He heard the confession of a man who had once been a young corporal. That corporal, at 62 years old and on his deathbed, finally unburdened himself. The priest inscribed the corporal's words into the back of the parish register, writing in a small, careful hand, choosing Latin, because he judged the content too dangerous for Spanish. That register currently resides in a private collection in Tucson. That's where I found it. The corporal spoke of one thing that haunted him for 50 years, a sound he could never silence. He described the Apache scout, the very last one still with the patrol when the trouble commenced, descending from the ridge that final morning. He walked straight to the captain, leaned in intimately so the other men couldn't overhear, and whispered 6 words. Those 6 words marked the end of the patrol. A brief note before we proceed any further. If this is the type of story that leaves you wanting more, I've compiled 10 of them into an audiobook called The Hollow Files. It's 5 hours long, covering 10 counties, and features the same voice you're listening to now. The link is in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. Now, let's get on with it. A quick question before I start, and I genuinely want your input. Where are you tuning in from tonight? Drop your location in the comments. A part of me is curious to see how far this narrative travels. I'll be reading them all. The scout went by the name Closson. That was the only name the cavalry knew for him. He refused to give his birth name to a white man. The detachment's payroll from April 12, 1886, lists him simply as Closson, Indian Scout Company B, mounted, sworn in on the 6th of August, 1885. There's no surname. A thumbprint sits where the signature should be. By the corporal's account, he was about 42 years old that spring. Tall for an Apache, nearly 6 feet, with the long, desiccated, ropey muscle that mountain-raised men often possessed. His face was narrow with high cheekbones, a prominent, pale scar traced from his left eye's corner down into the hairline above his ear. A souvenir from someone who tried and failed to take the eye. He wore his hair short, cavalry short, as regulations demanded, and he donned the dark blue blouse and canvas trousers issued to scouts. But beneath the blouse, around his throat, he always wore a small leather pouch. No man ever saw him remove it, even when he bathed. The corporal, in his deathbed confession to the priest, said that pouch was the one part of him the cavalry never possessed. Closson had served as a scout for nearly a year by the time the patrol crossed the border. Before that, his history was a mystery. He was Chiricahua or part Chiricahua, and a rumor persisted that he had killed a member of his own band, perhaps over a woman, or maybe a child, and had been cast out even before the Army got involved. The corporal heard a different version from another scout. Closson had discovered his own brother's body in a wash near the Bonita headwaters, and the corpse had been wrong somehow. The scout who told that story wouldn't elaborate on what wrong meant. He just said the word in English, then in Apache, then fell silent and went to check the horses, despite it being the middle of the night. The patrol consisted of 16 men, led by Captain Garrick Vorson. Vorson was 38, a Pennsylvanian by birth and a West Point graduate of 71. A methodical officer, the type who made lists. He had a wife and 2 grown sisters back east. No other family I could find. He had crossed into Mexico once before, in the autumn of '83, riding with Crook into the Sierra Madre after the renegades. He'd returned from that expedition 30 pounds lighter, and with a permanent tremor in his right hand. But he had returned, which put him ahead of 3 men who hadn't. They were operating under the new treaty with Mexico, which allowed pursuit of Apache renegades up to a depth of 50 leagues into Sonoran soil. The treaty, however, said nothing about what to do if they found something else. Under Vorson were Sergeant Augustus Threlfall, a thick-shouldered Iowan of 50, twice divorced, with a face like a sun-cracked saddle, Corporal Wendell Crane, 26, who would confess a half-century later, a farrier named Braceland, 2 civilian packers under contract, both Mexicans, unnamed in the register, simply called Los Arrieros, 2 other Indian scouts, a Tonto Apache called Biduya, and a White Mountain Apache the men called Nilan because his real name was difficult for English mouths, and 9 privates, mostly under 25 and from eastern states. 2 were German immigrants, in the country less than 3 years, speaking English with the deliberate, polished slowness of men anxious to be understood. They crossed the line on April 11, 1886. Their quarry, per Wason's orders, was a small band of hostile Chiricahua, estimated at 3 to 9 in number, last spotted moving southwest from the headwaters of the Rio Bavispe. The band had raided a Mexican ranch the week before. 2 vaqueros were dead. The rancher Don Saturnino Quintanilla had ridden 70 miles to the nearest American outpost on a half-dead horse to report the loss of 3 horses and saddle gear, demanding they be found. He didn't explicitly say it was Apache renegades. He only said, "Los que dejaron las pesadas," the ones who left the prints. The corporal later said that when the Mexican rancher used that phrase, he crossed himself, and Closson, listening from the corner of the company headquarters, looked up at the Mexican for the first time. Their eyes locked for what the corporal estimated was a long 10 seconds. Then Closson looked back down at the floor, and the Mexican said no more about who had committed the act. They rode south through country the corporal would describe to the priest with undiminished precision mesquite, ocotillo, and the gray bones of old cottonwoods along dry washes, bajadas littered with broken volcanic rock that could turn a horse's hoof, mountains like wet ash rising in tiers, dark pine forests crowning their tops. They rode at first light and rested at midday in whatever shade they could find. The heat reached 104 by noon, the corporal said. By the 3rd day, they'd exhausted the spare water the arrieros carried and began rationing canteen water, drinking only at dawn and dusk. On the 4th day, Closson found the first sign. It was at the mouth of a small, dry canyon the maps didn't name, a place where a bad water seep created a flat of pale alkaline mud, about the size of a cabin floor. A single, distinct print was pressed into the mud. The corporal saw it himself. It was the front paw of a mountain lion, a big one, the kind left by an animal near 200 pounds. Nothing strange there. Lions were common in those canyons. What was strange was where the print ended. It didn't continue like an animal's track. There was no second print further on. Just one sharp, complete print, every pad and claw distinct. Then, about a yard ahead, was the print of a man's bare left foot, and another bare footprint a stride beyond. Then nothing. Just dry rock that wouldn't hold a track at all. Closson squatted by the mud and was silent for a long time. Vorson rode up, looked over his shoulder, and asked what it was. Closson didn't answer. Closson said, in his careful, thin English, "This is not the man we are looking for." When Vorson asked what it was then, Closson replied, "I do not have a word for it in your language." Vorson pushed again, "Then give it in yours." The corporal heard the word Closson said. He couldn't write it down, couldn't pronounce it. In his confession, he described it as having a soft hiss at the beginning and a close sound at the end. When Closson said it, the other 2 scouts, the Tonto and the White Mountain, both stopped and stared. Biduya said something sharp in his own tongue. Nilan said nothing, just walked back to his horse and checked the saddle girth for the 3rd time that morning. Vorson, who knew only a handful of Apache trade words, waited for a translation. None came. Finally, Biduya said in English, "He says it is a skin one, a wearer of skins. We should go back." Vorson looked at Biduya, then at the track, and let out a tired laugh. He'd been in the field for 6 days, had a job to do, and wouldn't be turned back by a print and a folk tale. He ordered them to mount up, told the arrieros to fill the casks at the seep, and told Closson to take point and find a track he could understand. Closson obeyed. He took point. But the corporal noted that as Closson passed him on the way out of the canyon, the scout looked directly at him, the youngest man on the patrol, and gave a single, very slow shake of his head. It was a gesture the corporal would remember for the rest of his days. They rode south. Have you ever had that sensation of walking into a familiar room and knowing something is different, yet being unable to pinpoint what? Nothing moved, nothing missing. Just the atmosphere is wrong. Let me know in the comments if you've had that feeling, because that's the sensation I want you to hold on to. That's the atmosphere the patrol was riding into. They just didn't realize it yet. On the fourth night, they camped in the lee of a low ridge the corporal would later identify, with the help of a map at the priest's parish, as a place the Mexicans called El Cuello del Lobo, the wolf's throat. It was a narrow saddle between two higher peaks. The wind that night came from the south, carrying a smell the corporal said he'd never encountered and could never fully describe, except by what it wasn't. It wasn't a dead animal. It wasn't smoke or sage or any plant he knew. It was sweet, he said, sweet like overripe fruit that's gone past its prime into something else. Sergeant Threlfall dismissed it as a dead javelina downwind. Closson said nothing. Neither did the arrieros, though one of them eventually got up and went to the picket line, standing with the horses and stroking his lead mule's neck for nearly an hour. The horses were agitated. Two of them, the gray and the bay, kept trying to pull their pickets. The arriero calmed them with low, steady Spanish, but none of the horses lay down all night. The corporal was on second watch. He sat with his back to a flat rock, his Springfield across his knees, watching the southern sky turn that bruised purple of high country an hour before moonrise. During his watch, he heard what he first took for a coyote. Nothing unusual there. Coyotes were everywhere. What was odd was the location. It sounded directly above him. Not on a ridge above, but above, as if the call came from the air itself at the height of a man on horseback. He stood, turning a full, slow circle, rifle at the ready. He saw no coyote. He saw nothing at all. Just the saddle of the wolf's throat in the moonless dark, the small, red mound of the watchfire, and the sleeping shapes of the men. The sound didn't repeat that night. He sat back down. He didn't mention it to Sergeant Threlfall when he handed off the watch at 2. He convinced himself he'd been half asleep, that it was a coyote on the ridge and a trick of the wind. He told himself that for the rest of his shift and half of the next day. Then they found what was left of the third horse. I should explain about the horses. They'd started with 17 animals, counting mounts and pack mules. By the 5th morning, they'd lost 2 of the spare mounts. The first had pulled its picket during the corporal's watch and vanished. He hadn't heard a thing. The second was still tied to the picket at dawn but wouldn't get up. It lay on its side, breathing fast and shallow, eyes rolled white, with no visible mark. The farrier found no injury or obvious sickness. It died around noon. The arrieros butchered what meat they could, and Vorson ordered the carcass burned. On the morning of the 5th day, the older arriero returned from the picket line, pale as ash. He led the captain, the sergeant, and Closson to a spot about 200 yards downwind. The corporal wasn't allowed to go. He stayed with the picket line. When they returned, the captain had his hat in his left hand, and his right hand trembled so badly he had to shove it in his trouser pocket to hide it. Closson, walking behind them, showed no change at all. The men weren't told what had been found. Vorson simply said the horse had wandered and fallen prey to predators. He ordered the camp broken and the patrol to ride. They rode hard that day, due south, deeper into the Sierra Madre. That evening, after the men were bedded down, the corporal, as the youngest, took the captain his coffee. He carried the tin cup to where Vorson sat on a saddle by the watchfire. The captain took the cup without looking up and said, very quietly, more to himself than to anyone, it was the way it had been opened. That is what I cannot get past. It was the way it had been opened. The corporal didn't ask for clarification. He went back to his bedroll, lay on his back, and watched the stars emerge, which in that country happens very fast, like a curtain being drawn aside. He thought about the captain's words, about the way something had been opened. He thought about what Biduya had said 2 days before about a wearer of skins. Lying there, he understood that nothing on this patrol was going as planned. And listen, before we continue, If you've stayed with me this far, know that this is the channel that crafts these stories with care. If you're new, hit the subscribe button. We tell them slow, the way they were told. If you're hearing this voice on another channel, someone took the work. Let us know, we will pursue it. After that morning, Closson began riding a wider arc. Where before he'd ranged maybe a half-mile in front and a quarter-mile to the flank, now he was gone for hours, riding parallel ridges, working the country like a man who'd lost something specific. He'd return at noon and dusk, give Vorson a brief report, and eat in silence, sitting apart from the men. He wouldn't look at the other two scouts. Biduya had grown short-tempered, snapping at the arrieros over trivial matters. Nalin had turned quiet like Closson, and had tied a strip of red cloth around his right arm. The corporal didn't know what it meant. He later thought it might have been a marker, so that in the dark, one Apache could recognize another, making it harder for whatever was watching to pretend to be a man. On the 6th day, they crossed a higher saddle into a basin, about 3 miles long and 1 wide, with a dry creek and the ruin of a small Spanish mission at its far end. The Spanish had built it. The priest in Bavispe later told the corporal sometime in the early 1700s. It was called La Misión de San Lázaro de los Ojos, St. Lazarus of the Eyes. No one knew why it was called that. Some thought it was for an image of St. Lazarus that had wept during a drought. Others thought the Ojos referred to nearby springs. Either way, it had been abandoned by the 1760s after some trouble with the local Oodum. After that, no one lived there. Even the renegades avoided it. The Mexicans said it was un lugar que se acuerda, a place that remembers. Vorson ordered the camp at the basin's upper end, well away from the ruin for better sight lines. He told the men they'd rest one night and push west the next day. The arrieros refused to go near the ruin. They camped with the horses, built no fire, and sat with their backs to the mission, whispering prayers in Spanish all night. The corporal, lying 20 yards away, heard their voices shift slowly from prayer into something more like begging. Around midnight, the watchfire went out. That was the corporal's first sign of real trouble. Watchfires didn't just go out. The wood was too dry, the men too well trained. He sat up and saw the fire had turned to coals and ash. The man on watch, a private from Ohio whose name the corporal would later forget, was standing about 20 paces beyond the fire, very still, facing south toward the mission. The corporal called his name softly. No response. Louder. No movement. He got up, pulled on his trousers, and walked toward the private. Within 10 yards, he could see in the starlight that the private's mouth was hanging open, his eyes wide, fixed on something. The corporal followed his gaze toward the mission, half a mile down the basin. At first, he saw nothing but the broken adobe silhouette and the dark rectangle of the open chapel door. Then he saw that something was standing in the doorway. He couldn't say what it was. He described it in his confession as the height and shape of a tall man, very still, facing the camp. The impression he had, which he never justified in 50 years, was that it was waiting for one specific person in the camp to wake up and look at it. He grabbed the private's arm and shook him. Nothing. He slapped him. Nothing. In a panic, he turned the private bodily away from the open ground. The moment the private lost sight of the mission door, he gasped, stumbled, and looked at the corporal as if he'd never seen him before. "I was watching the fire," the private said. "The fire is out," the corporal replied. The private looked at the cold ash and began to cry. The corporal led him back to his bedroll, then sat by the dead fire for the rest of the night, his Springfield across his knees, refusing to look toward the mission again. He didn't need to look. He could feel it looking back. In the morning, the private from Ohio was gone. His bedroll was empty. His boots were neatly set at the edge of the blanket, his Springfield leaning against his saddle, his hat on top, his canteen full. The only thing missing was the man himself. Vorson sent 4 men to search the basin. They were gone 3 hours. They found one set of barefoot prints in the soft sand of the dry creek bed leading south toward the mission. The footprints stopped halfway across the basin. They didn't continue. They didn't turn. They simply ended, as if the man had been lifted out of his stride. Closson rode out alone in the late morning and worked the ground himself. He returned at noon and reported to Vorson in private behind the picket line. The corporal, currying his horse on the other side, overheard most of it. He told the priest 50 years later what he'd heard. Closson said, "Captain, I will tell you what this is and you will not believe me. And after I tell you, I will go to find it and will not come back until I have. If I am still myself when I come back, I will speak to you alone before I let any man near me. If I am not still myself, you will see the difference and the men will need to be ready." Vorson said, "Then tell me what it is." Closson said, "Some of my people will not say the name. There are reasons. The name is a door. I will say only what it does. It puts on the shape of what hunts. In open country, a lion. In timber, a bear or a wolf. In dark places, it puts on a man. It cannot keep one shape long, but it can keep it long enough. It hunts very slowly. It hunts by waiting. It chooses one out of a group, and it waits, sometimes for days, until the one it has chosen walks out alone to where it can be alone with him. Then it takes him. What it does with the body is not the part you should think about. What it does with the rest is." Vorson said, "The rest of what?" Closson said, "The man." The corporal stopped currying, the calm frozen in his hand. Vorson was quiet for a long time. Then he asked, "Why us? Why this patrol?" Closson said something the corporal repeated word for word. "Because one of your men is already looking at it the way the dog looks at the door before the door opens. It showed him in the canyon the first day. It has been with us since then. It is not in the mission. It has been in this camp the whole time. A breath here before what comes next. If this voice is one you'd want to spend more time with, I keep a longer collection. The hollow files, 10 cases, 5 hours. The same kind of quiet trouble I'm telling you about now. The link is in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. Let's get back to the story." Vorson didn't believe him, not all at once. But the corporal said the captain's face had gone the color of wet paper. Vorson told Closson to go and do what he had to. He told him to come back. He asked very quietly, "If you do not come back, what do I do?" Closson said, "If I do not come back by the second sunrise, you ride. You do not look behind you. You do not wait for any man who is missing. You do not bury the men who fall. You ride." Closson took 2 extra canteens and a satchel of pemmican in a small clay jar, which the corporal had always assumed held tobacco, but would later learn held something else. He took his Winchester Model 73 and a horn-handled knife carried in the small of his back. He left the rest of his gear at his picket. He didn't say goodbye to the other scouts. He didn't look at any of the men. He rode south down the basin toward the mission, and he was gone. Now, I want to ask you something before the final part. Have you ever been in a group, even a small one, and felt with absolute certainty that one of them was not who they were supposed to be? Not a stranger, someone you knew, but for an hour or a minute, or just the time it takes to set down a coffee cup, the person sitting across from you is off. Their face is right. Their voice is right. Everything checks. And yet, comment below. Tell me about that time. I have my own, and I don't speak of it often. The patrol waited. They waited all that day, through the long, hot afternoon and into the evening. The watchfire stayed lit this time, and Sergeant Threlfall doubled the watch. The corporal was on first watch with a private from New Jersey, named Linus Marbury. They sat back on a flat rock, watching the basin in both directions. For 2 hours neither spoke. Around 10, Marbury said, "Corp, look at the picket." The corporal looked. The arrieros were still sitting with their backs to the mission, praying. Biduya lay by the picket, hat over his face, asleep. Nalin sat awake, working leather between his hands. And out beyond the picket, on the far side of the horses, in the long grass at the basin's edge, a man was standing. He was a long way off, 200 yards, maybe more. Standing very still. The starlight was just enough to make out a man's shape, in what looked like the dark blue of a cavalry blouse and lighter blue, gray canvas trousers. The corporal raised his Springfield, sighted on the figure, and held it there for a long count. The figure didn't move. Marbury asked, "Is that Closson?" The corporal said no. He couldn't have said why. The figure was the right height, the right build, wearing the same clothes. But the corporal knew, in the way a man knows something in his own house has been moved during the night, that it was not Closson. It was someone else or something else, wearing a Closson shape. The corporal didn't fire. He told the priest 50 years later that he didn't fire because some part of him understood that if he fired and missed, it would know he could see it, and it would come. He lowered the rifle slowly and told Marbury in a whisper to look away, to look at the watchfire instead. Marbury turned his head. The corporal turned his head. They sat for a count of 10, faces to the fire. When they looked back, the figure was gone. Around 3 in the morning, Nalin, the White Mountain scout, walked over to the corporal and said, very quietly, "Do not stand watch tomorrow night. Do not stand watch the night after. Tie the red cloth on your arm. Tell no one why." He gave the corporal a strip of red cloth. The corporal tied it around his upper arm, under his blouse, where no one would see it. Nalin nodded once and walked back to the picket. The next day passed without incident. The men ate hardtack and salt pork, speaking little. The horses were thinning. The arrieros were getting worse. The older one had stopped eating and sat all day with his rosary. At noon, Sergeant Threlfall fell asleep in the shade of his picket. When he woke, he was not the same. The corporal noticed it first. Threlfall came out of the shade and called for coffee. The corporal brought it to him. Threlfall took it and said, "Thank you, son," in a voice that was Threlfall's voice, but slightly off, too smooth. Threlfall's voice was usually like a saw on a knot of wood. This was a saw on something softer. The corporal said nothing. He went back to his picket and watched Threlfall for the next 2 hours. Threlfall did all the things Threlfall always did: checked the men, cursed the farrier about a shoe, surveyed the country with his field glasses. The corporal couldn't point to a single wrong action, and yet he couldn't stop watching. Around 4, Threlfall walked over to him, squatted down and smiled. The corporal had served under Threlfall for 14 months and had seen him smile twice. Threlfall smiled now. "Corporal Crane," he said pleasantly, "what is that under your sleeve?" The corporal didn't move. He didn't look down. He said, "Sergeant." Threlfall pressed. "Under your sleeve, son, there's a lump," the corporal said very calmly, because he understood that calm was the only thing that might save his life. "It is a tobacco pouch, Sergeant. I have been keeping it under my sleeve, because I do not want the captain to see me carrying it. He has been hard on us about the tobacco ration." Threlfall looked at him for a long time. His eyes, the corporal noticed, were the wrong color. Not very wrong, just slightly. Threlfall had had blue eyes for 14 months. Now they were paler, almost gray, like ice water on a cloudy day. Threlfall said, "Show me the pouch, Corporal Crane." The corporal said, "Sergeant, I will. But first you tell me one thing." Threlfall waited. The corporal said, "In Yuma, 2 summers back, you told me a story about your first wife. You said she had a sister. Tell me the sister's name." A silence. The real Threlfall had told that story one drunken night. His first wife's sister had been named Geneva. The corporal remembered because it was unusual, and because Threlfall had cried when he said it. The thing wearing Threlfall's face didn't move for 3 seconds. Then it stood up slowly. It didn't answer. It didn't blink. It walked back to its bedroll, sat down, and began cleaning its rifle. It didn't look at the corporal again that afternoon. The corporal got up, walked to Nalin by the picket, and said with barely moving lips, "It is the sergeant." Nalin didn't look up from his leather work. "No," he said, "it is not yet the sergeant. It is sitting beside the sergeant. But it has not finished putting him on." That was the longest night of Wendell Crane's life, he told the priest. He didn't sleep at all. He didn't look toward the sergeant's bedroll. When his watch came at 3, he stood it not by the fire but at the edge of the picket line, back to back with Nalin, facing outward. Nalin chanted low all the while, soft enough that no one else could hear. The corporal stood with his Springfield and listened, not letting his hands shake. At first light, Closson returned. He came down the basin from the south, on foot, his horse gone. He had dried brown blood on his blouse, not much but enough. He approached the camp at a slow walk. 100 yards out, He stopped and called for Captain Vorson in his thin English voice. Vorson came out alone, the way Closson had instructed. He walked down the rise toward Closson. Closson waited. Vorson stopped about 10 paces away. The corporal watched from the picket. He could see Vorson's face but couldn't hear what was said. Vorson looked Closson over for a long time. Then he took one step closer, then another. Closson didn't move. Vorson asked something. Closson answered. Vorson asked something else. Then Closson did the thing the corporal would remember forever. He walked the last 3 paces forward, stood so close their hats nearly touched, leaned in, and whispered 6 words into Vorson's ear. Words the corporal couldn't hear. Vorson stepped back as if from a fire that had flared up. His face went white. He turned, walked steadily back up the rise to the camp's edge, and said in a voice that was somehow steadier than it should have been, "Sergeant Threlfall, saddle the patrol. We ride north in 20 minutes. We do not stop at El Culo del Lobo. We do not stop at the Seep. We ride." Threlfall, or what sat beside Threlfall, looked up slowly. "Captain, the men have not eaten." Vorson didn't look at it. 20 minutes, Sergeant." The thing with Threlfall's face stood up. The corporal watched it walk across the camp. As it did, it glanced once, just for an instant, at Closson, still standing on the rise. And the corporal saw that Closson, for the first time on the whole expedition, smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who has just locked a door from the outside. The thing with Threlfall's face turned and saddled its horse. They rode out of the basin at 7 in the morning, leaving the dead watchfire, the abandoned bedroll, and a saddle no one would touch. They rode north. Closson rode at the back, a quarter-mile behind, alone. The corporal asked Vorson why Closson was so far behind. "He is making sure," Vorson said. The corporal didn't ask what he was making sure of. They rode all that day, through El Culo del Lobo, through the canyon of the Seep, without stopping. They rode until the horses were near collapse, then made a cold camp on an exposed ridge with no fire, sleeping in their boots with rifles in their arms. Closson didn't sleep. He sat on a rock at the camp's edge, watching the southern horizon all night, unmoving. In the morning he was still there. The corporal, looking at him as he stood, said he'd aged 10 years in a night. On the 3rd morning, they crossed the border back into Arizona. At a small Mexican customs post with 2 flags, American and Mexican, Vorson ordered a salute. Even the German privates, even the arrieros, even Closson saluted. The thing wearing Threlfall's face didn't raise its hand. By then it had stopped pretending. Its head was held at an odd angle. It didn't eat. It didn't speak. Its horse had begun to shy. On the 2nd day across the border, it threw the rider and ran. The thing got up and walked behind the column for the rest of the day on foot. The men didn't look at it. The corporal said that on the night before they reached the American outpost, he stood watch and saw it some distance away in the moonlight. Its mouth full of something dark, working its jaw like an animal trying to chew something too big to swallow. In the morning the thing was gone. Tracks led away toward the south, mountain lion tracks. They didn't turn into anything else. They simply went south and didn't return. The patrol reached the outpost at noon. Vorson reported 3 men lost, 1 private to desertion, 1 sergeant to brain fever, and 1 arriero to dehydration. The renegades hadn't been found. Permission to return to garrison was granted. The file was closed. Sergeant Augustus Threlfall of Ottawa, Iowa, was listed as deceased on April 27 in 1886. Caused brain fever in the field. No body was returned. It had been buried in Sonora per regulations. The grave's coordinates were never recorded. Closson was honorably discharged 3 weeks later. His discharge papers cite expiration of service. He drew his final pay of $14.40 in rations for a week. He left the post on foot, walking east, and was never seen at any cavalry post again. Bedoya served another 6 years. Nalin left 2 days after Closson, also walking east, also never seen again. Captain Vorson finished his career on garrison duty in Wyoming, never accepting another field command. He retired as a major in 1898 and died in 1899 of a heart condition in his sister's home. His sister wrote that he'd become deeply pious, sleeping with a lamp burning, saying he didn't want to be alone when he died, afraid of something he'd heard long ago. Wendell Crane, the corporal, mustered out in 1889, drifted south, prospected, married a Mexican woman in Canania in 1892, and lived in northern Sonora until his death in 1841. He had 4 sons, all named for saints, none ever crossing into the United States. He took confession only twice, once when he married and once on his deathbed in November 1841 in Bavispe. He told the priest the entire story. At the end, the priest asked gently, "What were the 6 words? What did the scout whisper to your captain?" Wendell Crane, with an hour left to live, opened his eyes and said, "Father, understand, I never heard them. I was 100 yards off." The priest said, "I understand." Crane said, "But the captain told me 2 weeks later, one night when he'd had too much to drink. He told me, and I never told anyone again. Not even my wife, not even myself in the dark." The priest waited. Crane said the 6 words. The priest wrote them in Latin, afraid of them, in the back of the parish register. The register sat for 90 years in Bavispe, was sold to a Mexican collector, and ended up in Tucson with a man I know, who let me read it. The 6 words in the priest's neat Latin translate roughly to, "It came back wearing my face." That's what Closson whispered to Vorson. That's why Vorson pulled the patrol out at a dead run. That's why the thing wearing Threlfall's face rode behind the column, not in it. Because Closson had told Vorson that the thing they'd crossed into Sonora to find was already inside the patrol. That Closson had cornered it in the mission. That he'd fought it and survived. That he was approaching Vorson alone so Vorson could see if he was still Closson. And Vorson decided the man in front of him was Closson. That the thing had taken someone else. But here's what broke the corporal, lying in his bed in that mining town 50 years later. He'd thought about it for half a century. If Closson had said, "It came back wearing my face," the man standing in front of Vorson, uttering those words, was the real Closson, the one who'd survived. That was the warning. Watch for the second one. But if Closson had said that, then by speaking it aloud, he'd given Vorson exactly the proof a thing wearing Closson's face would give to be trusted. The real Closson wouldn't have warned Vorson so plainly. He'd have used a sign only they knew, and he hadn't. Either way, one Closson went into that mission, and one Closson came out. The corporal rode 3 days back with that Closson, watched him, found nothing to put a finger on, and said goodbye to him on May 15. He watched him walk east on foot alone. On the night he died, the corporal told the priest that for 50 years, every time he looked in a mirror, he checked his own eyes for that pale, almost blue color. Every time he passed a stranger, he looked at their hands to see if they were shaking. Every time he saw a man walking alone at the edge of his vision, he crossed himself and looked away. Because he'd understood by the end that Closson hadn't finished the work. He hadn't killed it, only sent it ahead into the territories, where one of the 2 Clossons had walked alone on that May morning. And the corporal said with his last breath, "Father, it is still out there. I have felt it watching me from the day I came home. And I have been able to feel it because I had the red cloth on my arm that night. Nalin told me to never take it off and I never have. Father, look under my sleeve." The priest looked. Under the cuff of his nightshirt, on his upper arm, was a strip of red cloth so old and worn it was almost the color of dried blood. The priest noted in the margin that it had been tied there for 50 years and 7 months. He took it off after the corporal died, per his last wish. To be buried with the cloth in his hand, not on his arm. The priest didn't record his own thoughts. He only wrote at the bottom of the page a single Latin phrase, audimi, Domin, quia non finita est ista historia. Hear me, Lord, for this story is not finished. That is the story. I've told it the way it was told to the priest. The way the priest wrote it down. The way I read it from that parish register in Tucson in the summer of 2019. I've added nothing. I've taken nothing away. I've given you only the names the priest gave, supplemented where I knew them from the records. I haven't told you what to think about the 6 words. You'll have your own thoughts. Tell me in the comments which Closson you think came out of that mission. Tell me whether you think there's a man somewhere east of the Chiricahuas with pale blue eyes and a scar from his brow to his hairline, who's been walking these last 140 years, taking one shape then another, riding the long roads west, getting closer. If you want more like this, I've put 10 together in the hollow files. 5 hours, 10 counties, the same voice. The link is in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. If you're new, the subscribe button is below. I read every comment, and I keep a list of the places people are listening from. I haven't yet had 2 from the same town. Maybe yours will be the first. Stay with me for the next one. Sleep with a light on tonight if you need to. There's no shame in that. There never has been. This response is AI-generated for reference only.